Hello, my philosophers. I'm here with my TBR and currently reading for this summer. It is currently near the end of June, so I'm late in getting this video out, but it has been a really fun month for me so far. Loving the Gemini energies that were around, just being social, actually getting out for the first time in a very, very long time, doing some very cool podcast collabs with people, and teaching my summer classes and creating some exclusive content for them. So I have finished 4 books so far. I did a video on one, Elaine Scarry's, on beauty and being just. She talks about what beauty is in the tradition of Plato's Symposium, that it directs our attention. It is a sort of sublime encounter, more in like the Nietzschean way, that can be rare, can be particular and individual, but incites us to create more beauty and to recognize it and to want it in our lives. And she talks about the sort of critiques of beauty and redeems beauty from those critiques, or at least attempts to. And I thought it was a really good book. I also finished Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. This is about Boethius, who is imprisoned. There is an upcoming execution, and he is visited by Lady Philosophy, who sort of shifts his perspective and helps him understand that he shouldn't necessarily be in despair. If we are playing with Lady Fortune, one thing we should know about her is that she spins her wheels, and so we can't necessarily blame her for the more unfortunate kind of things that happen in our lives, because we have to accept her for who she is. But in a sort of Christian kind of slant, she says that to transcend this sort of going back and forth with fortune, the closer you get to the mind and the will of God, aligning with that, the more stability we can have in our life, kind of also, I guess, in a stoic sort of way, having the kind of inner peace. And Boethius also finds problematic how it seems that bad people get rewarded and good people don't. And again, in kind of a Christian slant, there is, and Stoic as well, are the people who are not virtuous, are they really happy? And I think there's kind of this implication of, and this might be my overlay on it, an implication of the afterlife, getting rewarded then. If not in an actual afterlife, then, with maybe your reputation of people who really knew you. So the arguments are sort of along those lines. I'm doing an independent study on Immanuel Kant this summer, and so I finished his Perpetual Peace and Other Essays, translated by Ted Humphrey. This is a Hackett publication, and it has essays such as the answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Speculative beginning of human history, idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan intent, maybe my favorite title on the proverb that may be true in theory but is of no practical use. I love that. The end of all things, and then To Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. I think this is a really great book of Kant's, or collection of Kant's works to start with. Especially if you are more of a beginner in philosophy or just haven't read any Kant, because this talks about his historical views, his views on morality and ethics, also his metaphysics, and his epistemology. So it kind of runs the gamut of some of his ideas. So I would recommend it. It's very accessible. In my intro to philosophy class, I give my students the What is Enlightenment essay, and then I just talk about his ideas about history, because I think they have interest. It's interesting to put Kant in that respect in conversation with, say, Nietzsche's understanding of history and also Hegel's. And then I read my first Edinger book, a Jungian book, and this is The Creation of Consciousness, Jung's Myth for Modern Man. I very much enjoyed this. If you've joined my Study With Me series, then I think I was reading and then made some comments on this. He basically says, like many others that we have, such as Byung-Chul Han, that we are outside of a myth-making era, that we no longer collectively really grasp onto myths. And this can be argued against. You can look at maybe some of the superhero movies that are out there, and the comic books, and even anime, and just some of the stories, mostly made into films, that have caught collective attention. And I think that could be, one could look at those stories and kind of see what's going on in there. And certainly we do have a tendency in our society right now for apocalyptic themes, which I see as a sign that we are desiring collectively kind of an ego death and a rebirth to something sort of more stable and communal and caring toward the earth, and also even kind of a golden age, like you see in Hindu cosmology with, the Kali Yuga moving into something that is drastically better and going through that cycle. So Edinger offers Jung's story in answer to Job, where God is seen, or Yahweh is seen, and he specifically means our concept and image of God, not necessarily a literal God. We see Yahweh's movement from unconscious to consciousness, mainly looking at the sort of ethics and ethical humanity of Job as a model and an inspiration. So it's the idea of this kind of collective movement of individuation, and Edinger thinks that, maybe we can't have a completely religious myth anymore, but we can have a psychological one, looking at collective consciousness. So those were the 4 books that I have read. I put those up. And each morning, I'm going to start with my reading out loud books. Each morning I read either the poems of Emily Dickinson, or I'm reading this Anne Carson's Eros the Bittersweet. I think that there's a lot of benefit and pleasure in hearing your voice and articulating words. I think I'm not sure that a lot of people read out loud anymore. Of course, you have, actors who are memorizing their scripts and performing them, but some books are quite well suited to, spending about 15 minutes reading them slowly and articulating the words. I think it helps with our memory. It helps us with vocabulary acquisition because we are maybe saying words repeatedly that we don't usually say. And it, I think, helps garner our attention because reading out loud is a different temporality. So I really like Emily Dickinson. I sort of got into her biography and just her personality and then kind of turned to her work. I found her own sort of transition from being quite social and sort of quote unquote normal in that sense to her self-isolation, where she was still keeping up intimate correspondence with people and writing prolifically, but she just wasn't going out into the world anymore. And that really spoke to me, as I have for the past 5 years, been in that kind of self-isolation ever since the pandemic, and I'm sort of emerging from that, so I don't think that's going to be my future. But it's interesting to kind of find a tribe or find like-minded people, because I think a lot of times we judge ourselves for the stages that we're going through, or the predicaments or states that we're in, or our tendencies, or what we're avoiding out of fear, and what we're gravitating to even out of love or necessity or survival. But if you kind of expand your perspective and maybe start reading biographies of different philosophers and writers, poets and mystics, you'll find that there's a variety of ways that people live and exist and navigate the world, both medicated and unmedicated. I'm thinking about this book that I read at the end of last semester, Mason Curry's Daily Rituals, and he has little sort of vignettes on different people like Thomas Mann and Karl Marx, Francis Bacon, Kierkegaard, Voltaire, and so on. And it's just interesting to see these sort of brilliant artists and writers and thinkers, how they lived their lives, maybe not in a quote-unquote normal way, but they had to take their own path. And I think that's such a comforting realization to come to. We don't necessarily have to conform to what we think is the sort of dominant ideal. Not everyone might understand those of us who are, have our own particular anxieties or tendencies or quirks. We might be working through them, or we might be, accepting them. But I think that we don't need to necessarily outsource or take a ton of stock in the impatience or the lack of understanding of others. With all of us, we really only understand what is tangential to our own experience. That's why I think, some traditions like Buddhism say that really a path of some kind of suffering is a way to compassion. It might not be the only way, hopefully it isn't, but those of us who have suffered in different ways or felt different can sometimes be a little more accepting and aware of other people's difference. And, there's nothing really, I think, evaluative about that. It's really just a neutral thing. Everyone has their own paths and their own capacity to understand. But it seems to have some truth to it. So I really like the cadence of Emily Dickinson's poems. Something that I was reading today, I will read to you just so you can get a kind of idea. This is a poem from the summer of 1863. They called me to the window, for 'twas sunset. Someone said, I only saw a sapphire farm and just a single herd of opal cattle feeding far upon so vain a hill as even while I looked dissolved, nor cattle were, nor soil, but in their room a sea displayed and ships of such a size as crew of mountains could afford, and decks to seat the skies. This too the showman rubbed away, and when I looked again, nor farm nor opal herd was there, nor Mediterranean. So I think there's just such pleasure, I think, in reading the poems, and it's a way to bring poetry into your life as well. Anne Carson's Arrows, the Bittersweet, is very inspiring to me, informative. I feel like she's teaching me about desire and eros. There's some wonderful Greek passages in here as well, which she translates, but she leaves the original Greek. And since I'm working on this summer becoming familiar with Homeric Greek and classical Greek and also Latin, I find this really helpful in kind of challenging me to pronounce the words and to get more familiar with kind of reading in that sort of non-Latin script. So her ideas of eros really do come from classical Greek literature and poetry, and also some contemporary. And she says that, eros is a reaching, it's a lack. So it kind of requires some kind of unfamiliarity and distance, because, once you sort of, if you're able to obtain that apple and you take a bite, then that's when eros seems to sort of disappear and decline. And, so I think if that's kind of the idea of eros, that eros is that daimon, that bittersweet sort of spirit that comes upon you and dissolves your flesh and overwhelms you in this great passion that has pain in it and, causes so many of us to write poems of ache and longing, then that maybe is not the main current that can be in sort of sustained relationships. And she talks about Plato's work, Lysias, and how there's this raising up of the non-lover who tries to bypass eros completely, and also the temporality of eros, and has a kind of calm, composed openness, acceptance of their subject of love. And there's sort of freedom and liberation in that, in a sense. And I kind of wonder if my focus and my preference of friendship rather than romantic relationship is my way to put myself in that kind of calm, composed, sustainable, non-lover place. But there's problems with the tradition of, in classical Greek, of the sort of older person wanting to stall the younger subject of love, so that the lover can gain the most pleasure. Carson talks about how it is in the sort of lovers, the older lovers' possessiveness and jealousy and, desperation for this continual kind of stream of eros and desire. And, there's also, I think, because of that dynamic in that tradition, some kind of kind of egoic supply that the older lover obtained from the younger subject of love and desire. And so Carson says, the lover wants to keep the beloved homeless and dependent and non-educated away from philosophy. And strangely enough, I see a kind of connection between that particular archetype and the narcissistic parent who uses the child even as an adult and tries to halt growth and uses the child as emotional supply. And there's even like some emotional incest that I would say that happens, and sort of, depending on how long that goes on, that dynamic goes on before the child breaks out of that dynamic and is aware of what's happening. They are going to have effects on their ability to enjoy intimacy with others, because they are equating that intimacy with psychic violation. And so I guess I'm doing a bit of a kind of Freudian psychological read on this older tradition, but of like the older lover and the younger lover. So, I guess that's on my mind. Speaking of philosophy, or not philosophy, but psychology, I'm also reading Freud's The Psychology of Love. This is a book of collected works about sexual theory and erotic life. There's even an essay on female sexuality. It's starting with, and I just really started this, it's starting with the case study of quote unquote Dora, this 18-year-old girl who had sort of an encounter of violation with her father's friend. Her father was really friends with the wife of this man. And when she was 14, and this older man was sort of, I think, infatuated, enamored with her. And so, she had sort of these neuroticisms and pathologies that she was going to Freud for. And it's interesting to read Freud talk about, sort of like when and why disgust crops up in terms of intimacy when there has been a traumatic event. And again, I'm finding this very helpful for my own sort of personal past and childhood family dynamic. So like I said, I'm doing an independent study on Kant. So right now I am reading 2 of his works. I'm reading Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. I'm finishing up section 2 today. I've really enjoyed sort of reading his ideas about divine will, holy will, good will, and how he is against, or he finds inclinations, desires, and instincts suspect, and thinks that nevertheless we habitually kind of make decisions based on our desires and inclinations, when we really should be basing our decisions on reason. And a lot of times when we think we are double-minded in something, we feel indecisive, we feel at odds with ourselves because we don't know, maybe we want to pursue a relationship or a kind of relationship, but we think maybe also we have some resistance to that. Well, Kant says that we can get a lot of clarity if we don't just see those contradictory tendencies and desires as equal, but we look at and we try to filter out, well, what is really an inclination of a desire that, we're seeking pleasure, and what is actually our logical, reasonable thing? Because a lot of times I think we justify going toward our desire, thinking, oh, well, you only live once. Why am I restricting myself? Why don't I just fall into, what I know will bring me pleasure and experience that desire? But Kant says that, that's not the highest good. We will probably regret that decision of desire. We will burn out. And if we can follow, doesn't mean we ever, because I'm using the example of relationships, it doesn't mean that we always have to shy away from feeling, but we can have feelings that are reasonable, and I would say also that align with our true kind of vision and value for ourselves, what we need, what we're capable of. And that can contrast with sort of this impulsive kind of whim that we sometimes follow to the disadvantage of ourselves and also of others. So I'm really enjoying it. I'm also reading and also rereading, because I have read parts of this before, The Critique of Pure Reason. I think that I am, reading through the transcendental analytic, transcendental logic right now. I'm not super far. I think I'm about 130 pages through it, but I am in a reading group on Discord, and we meet every Sunday, and that really encourages me to kind of reread the sections that I've gone through recently and take notes. And I would say that, anyone who hasn't read this, if you've read at least a good few years of philosophy, you will not find it that difficult. I think Kant is actually a really good writer, and I find it quite accessible. So I haven't spent a lot of time with the next two books, but I am turning to them when I can. The Cambridge Companion to Kant, edited by Paul Guyer. This is good. I think that some of these Cambridge writers, though, they are of the analytic tradition. And so for me, that is a little harder to read and kind of keep up my attention. I think I naturally fall more into the continental side, but it's just kind of the analytic sort of style and a way of writing that I think I find sometimes a little more difficult. But nevertheless, I think these Cambridge editions are good, and I have them for various philosophers. And then, of course, perhaps unsurprising to those of you who have followed me for a while or know me in actual IRL, I am reading the correspondence of Kant, and I love these collections of letters, because usually if it is like a Cambridge edition or whatever it is, really, I'm always reading in the introductions to it that they tried to choose the letters that had philosophical ideas and concepts. And so I think it does help you understand the ideas of the philosopher that you're reading. I will be teaching an ethics class on campus for the first time at my college in the fall. So I have this third edition of a Routledge Contemporary Introduction to Ethics. I've kind of skimmed through it so far, and I think it will be really good for me to read in the summer as I'm kind of planning out how to organize the class. And it might be also a text that I assign to students because I like it that much. I am reading a couple of novels. I am reading my first Umberto Eco book. I have chosen The Name of the Rose. And this book follows a monk and his sort of teacher or master, and who is involved in politics. It is set in, I think, the 14th century, the 1300s, and there has been on one monastery a series of murders. Monks are being murdered. It has something to do with this library that is kind of kept under lock and key, and I just think it's such a beautiful, interesting example of philosophical literature, and I'm very much enjoying it. I think I'm not quite halfway finished with it, but I have been devoting my time a little more to the second novel, The Morning Star by Carl Nosgard. And this is sort of if you watch independent films that don't really have a plot but kind of are more interested in just the movements of the characters and kind of getting to know them, this book has that kind of feel, and I really like that. And so basically each chapter introduces you to or revisits a character that, and these characters are in different relationships and they're doing different things, and sometimes they're connecting with each other, like they're around each other. And they have meetings, but there's this numinous kind of light that comes up in the sky, and it's bright and it's glittering, and it just captures your attention. And so it shows at some point in each of the chapters the main character and maybe other people around them notice the star. And so there's not a real explicit sort of meaning to it. I think it's just a contemplation on what happens when our mundane selves and lives sort of meet the numinous. And I think we all have dreams that are a little more numinous, and we also meet sort of cosmic celestial happenings in our dreams, and I've always loved those dreams. But I think he's a great writer, and I know he's beloved in Norway, is it? So I'm really glad to dip my toes into his works. I'm always reading Jung, so I've not spent too much time on it this summer, but I am reading The Man and His Symbols. I've read quite a bit of Jung in the collected works, and I know that this Man and His Symbols was written near the end of his life when he was writing with other colleagues, and he had just done an interview and other people wanted him to write something for the public. So they could kind of know his ideas and thoughts. And so it starts off with this 93-page essay on approaching the unconscious, and then you have von Franz writing in here, Henderson, just a couple of other people. So I think it's good, especially since I feel my students who are getting into Jung gravitate toward this book. I just want to be able to be in conversation with them about it. And I'm reading Psychological Types, which is volume 6 of the collected works of Jung, and very much enjoying his chronological foray from, trying to apply his types of the introvert and extrovert to even the early church fathers and different kinds of concepts and positions on the existence of God, etc. So I'm very much enjoying that when I can get to it. And then lastly, I'm doing an independent study on the philosophy of aesthetics. So the Elaine Scarry book on beauty and justice was my first book. This summer, I'm also reading Jean-Luc Nancy's The Ground of the Image. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, probably not. But it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of Baudrillard and maybe like postmodern kind of works. So, and this is a collection of his essays. There's one on image and violence, forbidden representation, where he talks about if we can represent something like the concentration camps. So I don't know. I mean, I am sort of enjoying it. I think maybe what he is interested in talking about is not necessarily, so far, at least in this book, what I am particularly preoccupied with in like concerning beauty and art, but I'm still reading it. What I do find I align much more with is Gadamer's The Relevance of the Beautiful and Other Essays. I'm absolutely adoring this book. I guess because maybe I do sort of lean toward classics and the canon and continental philosophers. And, you know, he's talking about Kant, he's talking about Hegel, and I just kind of, and Aristotle, and I kind of love that. So this is a book probably that, this will probably be the one that I finish next, if not the Carson. So, yeah, that is all that I'm working on so far. When I finish the groundwork, Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, I'll probably add another one of his books or just try to get through a little more of Critique of Pure Reason. I'm hoping to get through as much Kant as I can this summer. I just felt that it was time to focus on him and give attention to him, and I strive for more fluency when I'm lecturing on him. So since I'm teaching the ethics class in the fall instead of Intro to Philosophy on campus, you know, reading Kant this summer will greatly benefit my students. Let me know in the comments below what you are reading this summer. And I always try to read maybe 24 or 25 books in a year. The summer break is really when I get to finish books. I'm reading a lot all year, but I don't get to finish a lot of books. So I'm probably reading thousands of pages, but I strive for 24 or 25 that I actually finish. So we will see how much I can read through this summer, but I'm also trying to balance quality over quantity and really reflect. And I've always been a person that, you know, pauses several times on a page to annotate or underline, write my marginalia out. So I tend to be somewhat of a slow reader. Thanks, everyone. I'll catch you next time.